Okay, I fully realise that this was a video that very few people were actually ever going to be asking for, but I'm of the opinion that The Lawnmower Man is more than deserving of a long-form video like this. This is a film that, on the surface, may appear to be little more than flash and artifice, a poorly aged cash grab aiming towards capitalising on the popularity of the horror author who inspired the film, without any real substance or style of its own. But looking a little closer reveals a confident, incredibly ambitious foray into science fiction filmmaking that was actually rather forward-thinking for 1992. Far from being a film that has aged badly, I'd argue that the themes and ideas present in this movie have only become more relevant and more important over time. And yes, the film's grotesque attempts at CG visuals and wildly disordered structure do ensure that it remains quite an easy target for ridicule, a so bad it's good movie, if you will. But I believe that this film is more than worthy of discussion, and perhaps of appreciation and re-evaluation. But I think I'll leave that final decision up to you. So, join me, if you would, in a deep dive into one of 90s science fiction cinema's strangest, messiest, most creative movies. You're watching a lengthy overanalysis of The Lawnmower Man. First, I would like to start with just a little bit of some history, just so that they're all on the same page going forward. If you're already sufficiently well versed in the life and times of the Lawnmower Man, however, do feel free to skip ahead to the timestamp on the screen right now. The Lawnmower Man is reputedly based on the Stephen King short story of the same name, which appeared in the collection Night Shift. And I say reputedly because the film bears essentially no resemblance whatsoever to that original story aside from the central image of a killer with a lawnmower that does appear towards the back end of the movie. It seems that the film was actually based on a script entitled Cybergod, and the Stephen King connections were later added to the script in order to give the film a wider appeal, and especially so off the back of recent adaptations like Misery and Pet Sematary, which were both critically and commercially very successful. King's name was actually quite predominantly featured in the film's original marketing before King sued to have this removed, citing the incredibly limited resemblance of the film to his original story. And re-releases have since simply bore the title The Lawnmower Man. And this is something that seems quite ironic when examining the film critically, because King's original story is serviceable, but not a particularly special slice of his distinctive brand of horror, especially amongst some of the stellar stories that populate his Night Shift collection. And despite what you may well have heard about Lawnmower Man, I'd argue that it mostly manages to match its fairly overambitious nature with some interesting explorations into technological advance and human nature. Is it entirely successful in this regard? Well, maybe, maybe not. But this film is the cinematic equivalent of throwing everything against the wall to see just what will stick. And I find it equal parts inventive, enduring, and endearing simply because of that. This is also a film that typically has a reputation for being a low-budget, B-movie-esque effort that was commercially and critically unsuccessful and was promptly committed to an afterlife of direct-to-video obscurity. And I'll admit, for a time, that this is what I assumed as well. But this is actually quite far from the truth. The Lawnmower Man was incredibly successful in the box office, grossing approximately $150 million upon its initial release, warranting both a theatrically released sequel in the film Beyond Cyberspace and 2 video games, The Lawnmower Man in 1993 and Cyberwar in 1994. There was also sufficient interest to warrant the release of a director's cut that runs approximately 30 minutes longer than the theatrically released version of the film. And what all of this suggests is that the film was reasonably well regarded upon its initial release in 1992, and has simply been largely forgotten about with the passage of time. Which, as we'll come to discover, is a genuine shame. I really do believe that this has the potential to be a bona fide cult classic. But I'll begin with a brief summary of the plot, and this is your spoiler warning for the entire Lawnmower Man movie, although I will be discussing certain elements of the plot in more detail later in the video, particularly the ending. So, Pierce Brosnan leads as the scientist Dr. Lawrence Angelo, He's been conducting experimental and dangerous research into the applications of virtual reality to enhance cognitive performance. However, after a disastrous incident in which a test subject escapes and kills a number of the facility's staff, Angelo is forced to retreat into his home in order to continue his research in secret. He decides that human testing is the next logical step forward, and enlists the intellectually disabled gardener Job Smith as his new test subject, telling Job that the treatments will be able to increase and enhance his intelligence. Of course, the treatments work better than either Angelo or Job ever suspect, and Job's intelligence begins to advance and increase at an exponential rate. And in addition, Job begins to develop psychic abilities that are, at first, incredibly difficult for him to control. However, with time, his mastery over these new skills increases. Eventually, Job professes himself a form of cyberchrist, attempting to plug himself into the online network and embed himself into every computer system the world over.
I'm going back to VSA now, and once I'm inside the mainframe, I'll have access to over 5,000 other databases. And from those 5,000, I can reach out again and again and again, eventually inhabiting the entire planetary network. By the year 2001, there won't be a person on this planet who isn't hooked into it. Hooked into me.
Telling Angelo that the signal of his success will be the sound of every telephone in the world ringing simultaneously. Angelo attempts to destroy Job by blowing up what remains of his physical body, whilst he attempts to enter entirely into the internet, and believes himself to have done so, asserting in the film's epilogue that this incident has taught him to temper his research more carefully in the future. However, we, the audience, know better. We witness Job escape into the internet in his very last moments, and the film concludes with the chilling sound of telephones ringing all over the world. Granted, that is a rather brief overview of the plot, and there are certain minor plot points that I've had to gloss over. But these are the major events of the film, and if you haven't yet seen it, that's all you need to know going forward. One of the film's primary themes is that of technological development, humanity's relationship with technology, and how it continues to define and influence our lives. And the predominance of this theme throughout the film is incredibly interesting given that The Lawnmower Man, as we established earlier, originally released in 1992. This is a movie that is throwing around terms like virtual reality, when such terms didn't really carry the same cultural currency that they do in the modern day. And I'd argue that the film's depiction of technology is not only very forward-thinking and incisive, but also one that is actually improved when examining the film in retrospect. Don't get me wrong, the film does harbour a deeply held optimism for the as of yet unrealised potential of technology and virtual reality. A sentiment that is reflected in the very heavy utilisation of CG that will fortunately appear quite dated to modern sensibilities. And this optimism is embodied by Brosnan's character, the radical, brilliant young scientist who envisions carving a brighter future for humanity with the help of these new technologies. And in the early portions of the film, it's almost a little difficult not to be taken in by his promises and his fundamental sense of idealism. He devotes his entire being to his work, even to the extreme detriment of his personal relationships and his connection to the world existing outside of his research. The film's depiction of this optimism and its attitude towards technology does begin to shift into something more uncertain and ambiguous as the film progresses. When I say that Dr. Angelo embodies the optimistic attitude towards the potential inherent in the development of technology, I mean that the film explores both the positive and negative consequences of that attitude. Angelo's decision to use Joe Smith as a test subject is fairly unethical at best and downright abhorrent at worst.
You know, Joe, I have other different games. I even have one that could help make you smarter.
I was born dumb.
But you would like to be smarter, wouldn't you?
I don't know.
Well, if you were smarter, I mean, people wouldn't be able to take advantage of you. Do you understand what I mean, Joe?
Yeah. Sometimes they do. They do.
Although Angelo professes good intentions and rationalizes his decision by speculating about the benefits of his experimentation on Job, the simple truth is that Job doesn't entirely understand exactly what it is he is agreeing to here. And although Angelo's own belief in his own research is resolute, because he seems in little doubt that the treatments he administers to Job will fail at any point, the effects of his experimentation on Job result not only in the death of Job, but of countless others as well. And it's true that Angelo would never have been able to predict this unprecedented outcome, but he never really stops to consider any consequences that his actions may well have, simply choosing to forge ahead with his work, resolute in the belief that it will eventually pay dividends. Angelo's optimism, put simply, is dangerous. Dangerous in that he believes he can control this emerging power that he fails to even really understand. Later in the film, the movie shows us that the original financiers of Angelo's project are aiming to steal and implement his research in military operations, and Angelo makes quite a distinct point of distinguishing himself from these individuals, asserting that he acts for the good and betterment of humanity and that they act selfishly. And yet, the film itself is careful to make no such distinction. Angelo, after all, applies just as much forethought and consideration for his actions as these soldiers and politicians. This is not to say that his idealism is misplaced. That is to say, Angelo was not wrong in hoping that this technology would be used towards humanity's development rather than its destruction. But there's a subtle undercurrent of hypocrisy in Angelo's active disdain for those who attempt to use his work towards their own ends. And this rather strange relationship between humanity and its attempts to control and dominate an emerging technology that they cannot really comprehend culminates in the film's climax. Angelo, leaving himself to an averted crisis, albeit with a number of dead bodies left in Job's wake, murders that Angelo himself is indirectly responsible for, delivers a monologue about how he plans to strip back his research, experiment more carefully and with more restraint.
For some reason, I've been given a second chance. So I'm taking my work underground. I can't let it fall into the wrong hands again. If we can somehow embrace our wisdom instead of ignorance, this technology will free the mind of man, not enslave it.
And then the phones ring. The world is drowned in Job's victory cry, the revelation of his rebirth as the Cyberchrist with his heel on the throat of humanity. And the film ends. It's a rather bleak, cynical, but ultimately quite poignant conclusion. Angelo's musings about the second chance that he and humanity have been granted to form a better, more careful relationship with technology are immediately crushed by the revelation that there is in fact no second chance. These characters are simply forced to live with the mistake that they have made. For me, this is a fantastic encapsulation of the film's attitude towards technology and humanity's relationship with that technology. The hubris of Angelo has ensured humanity's doom, presumably. The ending is suitably ambiguous in this regard, but it does not condone his optimism as being singularly wrong or mistaken. Thematically, the film seems to determine that our relationship with technology should be a careful one. That capacity for potential can be realised, but only if we, as a species, approach it and treat it with respect and care. And to me, that seems to be an idea that only becomes more relevant with each passing day. But the irony is, this idea is not an entirely new one. This is merely the recontextualization of an older idea in modern form. The Lawnmower Man, very, very loosely, seems to be an updated form of the Prometheus myth. For those of you who either don't know or would benefit from a brief refresher, the Prometheus myth refers to a story from Greek mythology involving the Greek god and titan Prometheus, who was said to have crafted humanity from clay. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gifted it to humanity, allowing us to develop far faster and further than we, as a species, would have been able to without the influence of fire. And, as a result, Prometheus was punished by the gods, bound to a rock and forced to have an eagle tear out his liver each day, the organ then growing back overnight so that it could be ripped out again the following day. This myth is a commonly used narrative across literature and the arts, with perhaps the most notable recontextualization of this story being found in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the gothic horror masterpiece involving the hubris of a young scientist successfully creating life, and then being unable to deal with the great and terrible consequences of his actions. And although the Lawnmower Man does contain very obvious allusions to Frankenstein, the most obvious parallel being between the scientist Frankenstein and Dr. Angelo, it seems that it is largely returning to and drawing from that original myth its primary influence. There are smaller allusions, of course, such as the prolonged shot of Angelo staring into a flame whilst delivering that important final monologue at the film's conclusion, but the film's focus is less on the creation of life and far more concerned with the fantastic and dangerous power of knowledge, and particularly so when that knowledge is misused and abused. Angelo here is the Prometheus figure, he who steals the fire and unleashes knowledge upon the world, whilst being woefully unprepared for the consequences. And it is the figure of Job Smith who is most relevant in discussing these consequences. The intellectually disabled gardener and lawnmower turned man god, the cyber Christ set to remake the world in his own image. Angelo's reckless handling of the flames that find their way into his hands indirectly result in Job's violent retribution towards those who have wronged him and the people he cares about, and culminates in Job's positioning of himself as the god emerged in the computer systems across the world. The film's treatment of religion is somewhat unsubtle and seemingly rather cynical, which seems fitting given the Lawnmower Man's belief in the inherent wonder and power of technology. Job, as the town priest even points out at one point, shares his name with a biblical figure that can be found in the Old Testament, and the biblical Job was a man whose faith was tested by God, an individual with a relatively comfortable life and large family. Quote, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and this man was blameless and upright, fearing God and shunning evil. However, when Satan points out to God that Job may not be so pious if God chose to forsake him, God elects to strip Job of his comfort and his happiness in order to test his faith. Job loses his family and his health, but still does not curse God. And thus, God restored his prosperity and doubled his former possessions. All his brothers and sisters and prior acquaintances came and dined with him in his house. They consoled him and comforted him over all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him, and each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. So the Lord blessed Job's latter days more than his first." And Job Smith seems to not only inherit the title of his namesake, but his punishments and suffering as well. Job is continually taken advantage of by those around him. Other than the inciting incident with Dr. Angelo, Job is tormented by an employee at a local gas station, berated by the members of the town, and is regularly beaten by a local priest who professes to be doing so for Job's benefit. However, there is no divine figure sent to intervene in the Lawnmower Man's recontextualization of this religious story. Instead, through the power granted to him through Angelo's experiments, Job is able to take his own revenge and eventually reinvents himself as the religious figure he found himself waiting for his entire life. I wouldn't go as so far as say as the film ever tries to dismiss or trivialize religion or belief, but it does distinctly lack presence and authority in a world that is dominated by science and technology. Job's assertion of his new status as a religious deity comes from an implicit recognition of the extent to which his powers have progressed and developed. He possesses and harnesses enough power that sets him aside from the rest of humanity and allows him to become comparable to a god in his own eyes. And I do think that, especially when the biblical allusions and ideas are laid out so clearly in conjunction with Job's development as a character throughout the movie, it would be quite easy to view the film as a dismissal of religion. Job, after all, is never saved by a benevolent God, but by the overwhelming powers of knowledge and science. He creates his own prosperity and his own retribution. But I think solely to come to this conclusion would be to misunderstand the film to some degree. Job's descent into madness and power ultimately ends in the eradication of both his physical body and his former identity, both being subsumed into the machine. Job, like Dr. Angelo, is dominated by a desire for knowledge, and it is the potentially dangerous consequences of the careless pursuit of such knowledge that the film defines itself by, And this is the point at which I've really got to come out and defend the film's heavy use of CG, because I'd argue that the film's visuals have actually aged fairly well. Job's technological manifestation of himself inside the world of virtual reality is grotesque, the human figure corrupted and perverted in this gross imitation of humanity. And regardless of how intentional these visual choices are, and I would argue that they are very much intentional, they really do serve to emphasise and reinforce the extent of Job's descent into self-destruction through this dangerous pursuit of knowledge and power. And I would argue that, as a film that plays with myth and stories, twisting and distorting them, changing their form and nature to better suit the concerns of the narrative and the sensibilities of a more modern audience, the structure of the original biblical tale still remains intact here. Job is not forsaken by God, however. If the film has any conclusions on the existence of a true God, it is that such a God has left Job's fate in the hands of his friends and family, the people around him. Human kindness and connection should be what saves Job, not divine intervention. But the people around Job forsake him, abuse him, manipulate him, and thus he is sent down a darker path wherein he remakes himself in the image of the technology that has granted him strength and power, when nobody else around him would do so. And Job, despite being warped and twisted beyond all measure by the finale of the movie, does reward the individual who showed him even the most basic human kindness throughout the film. A young boy by the name of Peter who befriends Job and treats him with respect. And as a result, the film's climax, Job assists Peter in escaping from the building that is set to explode in just a few moments' time.
Peter! We gotta get out of here! The whole building's gonna blow up!
The door's locked! It won't open!
Jesus. Oh, Peter. Oh.
Where's Job?
So are we if we don't get out of here.
Honestly, I think this is the real tragedy of the Lawnmower Man. Job's fate is tragic and emotionally resonant simply because it occurs because of the carelessness and indifference of the people around Job. The recklessness of Dr. Angelo, the physical and spiritual abuse of the priest, the town's larger attempts to make Job feel isolated and shunned, as if he doesn't belong. And that isn't to say that any of these individuals set out to lead Job towards his unfortunate fate, but the cumulative effect of all these actions is devastating and results in the true tragedy of the movie becoming realised. Firstly, on a personal level with the death of Job, and secondly, on a wider scale with the rebirth of the Cyberchrist Job, who announces his coming with the ringing of each telephone in the world. This ending does a fantastic job of binding the film's disparate themes and ideas together into one cohesive whole that ultimately allows us, as the audience, very few easy answers or simple solutions. The influence of technology, humanity, and religion in careful, considerate hands can be wonderful things. But if such elements are employed carelessly, recklessly, with little empathy or forethought, the consequences, as we see in the movie's final shot, can be devastating. I would like to spend a little bit of time discussing the performance of Jeff Fahey as Joe Smith here. I'll admit, I haven't spent a great deal of time discussing the acting and performances of this movie, mostly because I think that they're generally fairly proficient, if rather memorable. The sole exception to this would be Fahey. He has to portray every side of Job as it emerges throughout the film. From the sweet, good-natured, and severely intellectually disabled gardener, to the hyper-intelligent, confident man that Angelo's treatments transform him into. And, eventually, the deranged cyberchrist hell-bent on remaking the virtual world in his own image. I'd argue that a great deal of the film's dramatic beats and thematic concerns hinge entirely upon the believable evolution of Fahey's character over the course of the film. And his performance anchors the plot even when it begins to descend entirely into pulp madness. The subtle nuances that Fahey applies in these later scenes especially, in which his mind and philosophy have been corrupted by the influence of technology and power, but wherein there still remain brief flashes of the man who once existed, allow the story to have far more of an emotional resonance than it may well have been able to manage otherwise. But, ultimately, I hope that this video has given you an opportunity to be introduced to the Lawnmower Man, or perhaps re-experience that story in an entirely new light. It's a strange, sometimes a little silly, occasionally subtle, and always engrossing slice of 90s sci-fi and horror cinema, and one I really do believe deserves to occupy a far better critical and cult status than it does at the moment. I was actually lucky enough to see this film on 35mm in a double bill with the sequel, Beyond Cyberspace, and it was one of the most entertaining cinematic experiences I've had in a long time. But it also allowed me a clear gateway into the world of this movie, a world that looks suspiciously like our own. Yes, the discourse around technological development and its applications towards humanity is constantly shifting and evolving, and the question of artificial intelligence has eclipsed the issue of virtual reality quite some time ago. And yet, I'd argue that this film remains just as potent and just as relevant in the modern day as it was when it was originally released back in 1992. The details, of course, have changed, but this film's treatment of humanity's relationship with knowledge and technology remains both firmly rooted in the past and incredibly important for our future. And I sincerely hope that the message and ideas that this film imparts will be taken forward and remembered as technology begins to become a far bigger presence in our lives. Hello, and thank you for watching. If you did enjoy this video and would like to see more content like it, please don't forget to subscribe. It really does help the channel out. I am planning to take this channel in a direction where these longer form videos are the standard. I am planning to release a video on the Red Dwarf episode Out of Time in a couple of weeks. I'm really excited for that. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I will hopefully see you in the next one.